In this lecture, we're going to look at regulatory authorities. We're going to define what a regulatory authority is. We're going to look at examples of federal authorities and sectors. Then we're going to look at state-level enforcement. And finally, we'll end with looking at cross-border and transnational enforcement. What is a regulatory authority? It's a federal agency, department, or office that Congress authorizes to implement and enforce legislation. If you think back to an earlier lecture when we were going over the bill becoming a law process, we noted that Congress, when authoring legislation, will empower or authorize certain federal agencies with oversight, implementation, and enforcement. And so in that legislation, Congress will say, the FTC has authority over CIPP, or the Department of Health and Human Services has authority over HIPAA, or the Federal Reserve has XYZ power over Gramm-Leach-Bliley, for example. And that's what we see here with those examples. We're going to look at a table of authorities in the next slide. The important takeaway here is that a regulatory authority, again, federal agency, department, or even a specific office that enforces legislation. Similarly, a state attorneys general will enforce state-level laws. In California, for example, the California Attorney General is responsible for implementing and enforcing the California Consumer Privacy Act. And in Illinois, it would be the Illinois Attorney General that's responsible for enforcing Illinois' BIPA, or Biometric Information Privacy Act. This is a table of some of the major federal regulators in the United States alongside the sectors that they police. You'll remember that the United States is a sectoral approach, and so we have a case-by-case basis for different collections of data. We're not going to go over all of these different authorities in the CIPP US body of knowledge. For example, we won't talk much about DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, for example, or the Department of State. We don't do a whole lot with Treasury, even though the Department of the Treasury does come up during the financial section a little bit. We don't do much on the Department of Transportation or the Office of Management and Budget. But this is just a high-level overview just to give you an example of some of the regulatory authorities and the sectors that they oversee. Again, you don't need to commit this to memory. This is just an example. As we go through the body of knowledge, it will become clear which of these you need to remember. Going back to state-level enforcement, again, it's the state's attorneys general or attorney general that enforce laws at the state level. At the state level, it's the state's attorneys general that will enforce local privacy legislation. Each state has laws, for example, that are similar to the unfair or deceptive trade practices, or as I will probably abbreviate for most of the course, UDAP, unfair or deceptive acts or practices. Enforcement areas for attorneys general include information security, data breach notification, violation of sector-specific laws, and breach of contract. And a lot of the laws that we're going to look at, both federal and state level, include a private right of action. For the rest of the lecture, we're going to take a look at cross-border and transnational issues. With regards to enforcement, there are a few challenges. Those include cooperation, conflicting laws, and enforcement. And so, for example, in the European Union, where they have the GDPR, the ability of United States corporations or individuals, courts to obtain the personal information of EU citizens is very limited. And so that would be an example of a conflict. Similarly, with regards to enforcement, if the United States is trying to enforce laws on a Russian national or a Chinese national, those two governments may not cooperate with the United States, which would make it difficult to enforce any laws. An important document to remember is the OECD's recommendation on cross-border cooperation in the enforcement of laws protecting privacy, which was published in 2007. This document addresses common privacy issues, shares best practices, developed a set of shared priorities, supported joint enforcement, and provided an avenue for training and awareness. Two international bodies that are important are the Global Privacy Enforcement Network, or GPEN. This is a partner of the Federal Trade Commission, and the Cross-Border Privacy Enforcement Arrangement, which is part of APEC, again, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. An example of cross-border conflict, we actually looked at this just a moment ago. If we have one law in one jurisdiction that prohibits disclosure, such as we do with the GDPR, and another that compels it, like we might in the United States, there's certainly a tension there. And how these two jurisdictions, the United States and the European Union, reconcile that difference is something we're going to talk about in a later lecture. In this lecture, we defined regulatory authority as a federal agency, department, or office that Congress authorizes to implement and enforce legislation. We then looked at a few different examples. The Department of Health and Human Services enforces HIPAA, the FTC enforces COPPA, and the Federal Reserve enforces GLBA. Again, if that's a bunch of alphabet soup to you, we haven't got to these yet, but we will very shortly, I promise. Similarly, at the state level, we have state attorneys general that enforce state-level privacy legislation, and each state, this was an example we looked at, each state has laws similar to what we see with the FTC's jurisdiction over unfair or deceptive trade practices. I'm going to abbreviate that as UDAP, unfair or deceptive acts or practices. We looked at three cross-border issues. Those include cooperation, conflicting laws, and enforcement. And finally, we looked at two cross-border organizations with regards to privacy, the Global Privacy Enforcement Network, or GPEN, and the Cross-Border Privacy Enforcement Arrangement, CPEA, which is part of APEC.